Okay, here we are. It's time for the message this morning. I got my water here. Had some coffee here earlier. I got my Purell hand sanitizer. I think that's maybe the last bottle in the province, so it's worth more than gold right now. Well, I don't know how it's going for you, being on lockdown, being at home most of the time. I hope it's going really well. It's a lot of time spent with whomever you live with. For some of us, that's just living by themselves. For some of us, that's husband and wife. For some of us, that's family with kids. And I tell you what, kids on spring break, whew, it's going to be a long spring break. That's all I got to say. All right, I've been making these little videos here. I made this video. You can check it out on Facebook. I'm not going to play the whole thing right now. But I've been making these videos. My kids, especially one of them, has been so bored. We got to find things for them to do. So we've been making videos. And this particular video was about how to fight better. How brothers can fight better. And these guys are fighting all the time. So you can watch the video and find out about that. But I'll tell you what it's like with these two guys, Andrew and Nathan. One's 9 years old, one is 7 years old. Sometimes they are absolutely best friends. They have the most fun together. I'm jealous of how much fun they have because it's like they were made to be together. And other times, it is constant screaming and fighting all day long. Just 2 nights ago, I sent them up to get ready for bed, and I sat them down before we even sent them up and warned them about how to act. And don't lose your screen time for tomorrow by causing a big fight right now. And as soon as they went upstairs, they got upstairs, they made it about 3 feet, and then they exploded at each other into a huge fight. So on the one hand, now we're going to use these guys as an illustration, one of our illustrations today. On the one hand, relationships that could be the most life-giving, the best relationships in our lives, the ones that give us the most meaning and value and most success, why is it that those relationships often are the ones that blow up and are the very hardest to handle? Why is it that the relationships that could be the best are often the most difficult? Well, the answer is because we are fighting an invisible war. We are fighting a war with an invisible enemy. And that is the truth of life. We looked at that last week. We're in a series right now on the book of Ephesians in the Bible called A Grace-Fueled Life. And in this series, we've learned a whole bunch. In the beginning, the first half of the book was all about who you are in Christ. So the book is actually written to believers, people who have given their lives to Jesus, who have said, I don't want to run my life anymore. I want you to run my life, God, because I know that your plan is better than mine. Would you please forgive me for my sin? And would you please come into my life and help me to live for you? So if that describes you, if you are a follower of Jesus, you've given your life to Jesus, then this book is written to you. If that doesn't describe you, if you have not given your life to Jesus yet, maybe you're just checking this out. That's great. It's great for you to be here because you're going to hear what that life is like. So the first half of the book is all about who we are. We've been brought back to life from the dead. We were dead in our sin, in the things that we had done wrong. We were enslaved to the world, the ways of the culture around us, the ways of darkness. We were enslaved actually to Satan. And then God brought us back to life by sending Jesus to die for us on the cross. So that was the first half of the book. It's all about who you are. The second half of the book we talked about then is how should we live? If that's who we are, then what should we be doing? And there have been many lessons. You can go back and look at all of those messages on our YouTube channel. Many things we've learned talking about who we are in Christ, how we can live now. Some of these have been very practical. Now, last week we jumped ahead. We actually jumped ahead to the very end of the book, and we did the section in chapter 6 that's called the armor of God. So in that section, we learned what I said just a moment ago, that there is an invisible enemy in the world. We are fighting an invisible enemy. Our war is not against flesh and blood. So when Andrew and Nathan are fighting, why is it that their relationship, which should be the very best and most life-giving, they're brothers, they're different, but they're made to complement each other and have a ton of fun together. Why is it that that relationship often just crumbles and devolves into a spiral of fighting and yelling and messing with each other and all of that stuff that comes with it? It's because we're fighting an invisible enemy. And that's one of the big lessons we had to learn. It's not, Andrew and Nathan need to realize, you guys should be watching this right now, that it's not that they're fighting each other. That's what it looks like on the surface. But the real battle is against our enemy, the devil, who is trying to turn us against each other. So in looking at that, we looked at the war illustration last week. We looked at the illustration of armor. We need to be putting our armor on every day to be able to stand against the plan that the enemy has to destroy us. And that armor looked like making sure our minds and our hearts are in the right place. And then when we got to the sword and shield, that armor looked like two things in particular. One, it looked like protecting the person next to us. So we talked about last week how the shield that the Roman soldiers used, and remember Paul, as he writes this letter, he is actually sitting there chained to a Roman soldier. So he's looking at a soldier who's wearing at least some of the Roman armor. This is something he was around all the time. The armor that we're supposed to put on, this is the metaphor that's being used here, the illustration. It's not armor that's meant to be used alone. And I know a lot of people came back and said that was the most powerful part of last week, looking at that section, realizing that armor that I'm supposed to put on is not good for fighting alone. It's good for fighting as one body, one unit. We're going to talk about that more today. So the shield not only protects the person who's holding the shield, but it protects the person next to them. So as I fight this battle, I've got to have my brothers and my sisters to my right and my left also covering me with their shield of faith. So when things get really tough, when the enemy attacks and I feel like I can't stand in life, what do I need to do? I need to not only hide behind my shield of faith, but also the shield of the person next to me. I need to have my brothers and sisters in Christ come around me and pray for me and encourage me and help me and speak words of life into my life. The second thing that we talked about, so the shield, and then we talked about the sword. We need to strike with the sword that's in our hand. Whatever the strength is, whatever the power that God has given us, His word, prayer, our own particular gifts, we need to use those to drive back this invisible enemy. So that's where we were at last week, looking at the armor of God. Now, if you've been hanging around Community of Hope Church, watching our stuff online, you'll know that 3 weeks ago, so a couple of Sundays ago, we talked about chapter 4, the end of chapter 4. And the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5, the section there is all about waking up and living in the light. So the idea there is that this world, it puts us to sleep. It kind of lulls us into a trance with its way. And it's easy, just like getting distracted by a TV, it's easy to go the way of this world. And we have to make a conscious effort to wake up, recognize what's true. There's an invisible enemy out there. We need to be fighting him. We need to recognize what is true, and then we need to go live in the light. So it's possible for us now to walk in the light, to have that sword and that shield and use them. It's possible because of Jesus. But it's also possible for us to do nothing. Even though we're part of the army of God, this is an army that fights a spiritual battle. It's an army that he's using to bring back the whole world to himself. But it's possible for us to simply do nothing. So we need to wake up and live in the light. Now, we're only going to have this Sunday and next Sunday. We're going to finish up the book of Ephesians from the Bible. And what we're looking at both weeks is the section that comes in between those two pieces. So in between the armor of God in chapter 6 and the stuff we looked at the beginning of chapter 5, wake up and live in the light, in between that comes a section that's all about what the invisible battle looks like. How do we actually live it out? You know, if this were a battle with a Roman army, it's easy to think, what does that battle look like? Well, it looks like soldiers in a field fighting each other with shields and swords. But what about for us? This is an invisible enemy. The battle is often mostly invisible. So what does that battle look like? And we're going to see as we go through today what that battle looks like. It's kind of surprising. I think you're going to get a lot out of this. So, if I can click to the next slide. The message for today is entitled, Fight as One. Fight as One. We're going to start off we're going to be using the contemporary English version today, which is a little bit different version than we normally use. So if you've got your Bible at home, I don't know if you're going to have a paper copy of this version. You can use whatever version you have, but we're going to translate one particular word a little bit differently today than is normally translated, than most of the versions out there translated. Not because most of the versions out there are wrong, but because I think the word that they use most often gives us an impression that's not the right impression. It's not the impression Paul is trying to get across in this section. So whatever Bible you got, or you can watch it on the screen, we're going to start reading. This is in Ephesians chapter 5, starting at verse 21. We're going to look at this verse, which is the opening verse of the whole section. Now, what this section is about, it's about what the invisible battle looks like. And what it looks like is husbands and wives, parents and children, and work relationships. Isn't that striking? What this invisible battle looks like, it doesn't look like Roman soldiers on a field. It doesn't look like necessarily fighting against huge, obviously evil things. The invisible battle looks like relationships. In fact, these are the key relationships in our lives, right? Husbands and wives, parents and children, and employer-employee relationships. Now, what Paul's going to talk about, and we'll get to that in a minute, is masters and slaves. And we don't have that in our society, thank God. But really what he's getting at is very similar to employees and employers, bosses and employees. And so we'll look at that in just a minute. So we're going to start out with this opening verse here, verse 21. And then we're going to jump to the end of the section and work backwards, because I think it's going to be a little bit easier to get at if we start with work and we move toward marriage. But ultimately today, our main point is going to be on marriage, okay? So here we go. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. Honor Christ and put others first. Honor Christ and put others first. Wow. So this is going to be our main point for the message today, and you can write this down. It's very similar to the verse. Honor Christ, but I'm going to add the word by, and I'm going to change it to each other. Because I wanted to focus on the people who are right around us while we're on lockdown at home, when we're at work, for those of us who are still working, the people who are right around us. Here's the main point for today. Honor Christ by putting each other first. What does that mean? Let's move on, and we'll take a look at it as we go through first masters and slaves, which is like work relationships, and then we'll look a little bit at parents and children, and then we're going to look at marriage. So first of all, work. What does this look like? Let's read this section. We're going to come back to it more next week. But I'm just going to draw one point. We're going to point out one thing from it today. So here's what he says in chapter 6, verses 5 to 9. Slaves, you must obey your earthly masters. Show them great respect and be as loyal to them as you are to Christ. Okay. Try to please them at all times, and not just when you think they're watching. You are slaves of Christ, so with your whole heart you must do what God wants you to do. So here in this section on slaves and masters, which we're going to understand as employers and employees. So first let's paraphrase it. Let's say it in terms of our own situation. All right, so first he's talking to employees. So if you have a job, here needs to be your attitude in your job. You need to obey your boss. Do whatever your boss says. Of course, not whatever they say. If they tell you to do something wrong, don't do that. But in general, your bosses are going to be reasonable people. Well, maybe not always. But you must do what they say. Obey them. Not only that, you got to show them great respect and be loyal to them. Why? You're going to do it just like you would if you were working for Jesus himself. So here's the idea, and this is exactly the same idea that came in verse 21 of chapter 5, and the idea that's the main point for today. In your relationships, the way that you fight this battle is by honoring Christ and putting first the other person in whatever way is appropriate for that relationship in that situation. Okay, so can you see it here? So if you're an employee, if you have a boss, then what you're supposed to do in that situation when you're at work is you're supposed to honor your boss, you're supposed to honor Jesus by putting your boss first. You see it? You're not going to think about, okay, what am I going to get out of this, or how do I do the minimum? You're going to imagine that you're actually doing that job for Jesus himself. Your boss is Jesus. Now, even if your boss is a terrible person, this is what the Bible is telling us to do, how we can think about it, and how we can fight the invisible battle. Imagine that my boss is Jesus, and now how would I do my job if I were literally working for Jesus? Let's say I'm working, at a movie theater, or I'm working for a catering company, or whatever it is. We're going to imagine that my boss at the movie theater is Jesus himself. How am I going to serve the popcorn in that situation? It's actually going to change things when I imagine it that way. So I'm going to put the other person first. I'm going to honor Jesus by putting the other person first in whatever way is right for that situation. When you're an employee, the way to do it is by obeying. Okay? Now let's carry on. So we can see the second part. Now what if I'm a boss? What if I am a boss? Let's go forward here. Gladly serve your masters as though they were the Lord himself and not simply people. You know that you will be rewarded for any good things that you do, whether you're slaves or free. Slave owners. All right, so this is the section that's then to the boss, to the person who's the employer. You must treat your slaves with this same respect. Now, of course, the boss, the employer, is not going to act exactly the same way toward the employee as the employee acts towards the boss, right? The employer is in charge. They're the boss. They're going to say what happens in a situation. But they're going to do it with the same level of respect that was asked for the employee to show to the boss. Why? Because they're to imagine that Jesus is working for them. In that relationship, in that situation, the boss, the employer, is supposed to imagine and honor Christ by what's appropriate in this situation. Treat them with respect and don't threaten them. Don't be bossy just because you're the boss. Now, you are going to have to tell your employees what to do, but there are ways to do that. How would you do it if Jesus were working for you? Okay, now let's move on and take a look at parents and children. Again, we'll come back to work next week, and we'll see how that goes and get some practical tips for what we can do at work. But now moving backwards in the text in Ephesians, we see parents and children. That's the second relationship that he goes into. Okay? So let's read this. All right. Children, you belong to the Lord, and you do the right thing when you obey your parents. The first commandment with a promise says, obey your father and mother. Oh, we're going to have to change that translation a little bit. I couldn't find something that had just the right two pieces of translation here, but we'll get to it in a minute. Obey your father and your mother, and you will have a long and happy life. Parents, don't be hard on your children. Raise them properly. Teach them and instruct them about the Lord. So here we have Paul, and remember, the overall point here is honor Christ by honoring each other. Honor Christ by putting each other first. So whatever the situation you're in, you got to figure out what is the appropriate way to put the other person in this situation first. That's how I can fight the battle, this invisible war, and honor Christ in the situation. And here we see Paul explaining what that looks like when it comes to children. So the right way for children to honor Christ and put their parents first in a situation is simply to obey them. Okay, children, I know most of you are probably listening to this today, unlike usual. So kids, this one's for you. The right way in this situation is to do what your parents say. But now Paul also has a very interesting piece here. Notice the second part of it. He quotes one of the 10 commandments. And the commandment, actually, this translation I don't love because the word here is not obey. The word here is actually honor in the Hebrew, in the original 10 commandments. Honor your father and your mother, and you will have a long and happy life. So what we see is that children actually are supposed to change as they grow. When they're young, they start out, the appropriate way for a young child to honor God and put their parents first is simply to obey their parents. But as they get older, that's meant to eventually change. And this is why we have so much trouble with teenagers. I don't know, there's only a couple of teenagers in the room today, but there's teenagers watching online. It's because the relationship is changing and what's appropriate is changing. Can you see it? By the time they get to be adults, the proper relationship between parents and adult children is not obedience. Adult children are not just supposed to do whatever their parents say. In fact, in that situation, it's supposed to be honoring. The right way to put parents first if you are an adult is to honor them. And that's going to mean different things depending on exactly what the context is and exactly what's going on in your relationship with your parents. So as kids grow up, they make a transition from obeying their parents to honoring their parents. The right way for parents to honor Christ by putting their children first, the right way for that to happen is that they would not exasperate their children. They would not make it really hard for them. They wouldn't be too hard on them. And they would bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So basically what this means is parents are supposed to be thinking about, how can I really help my child? My goal as a parent is not just to get my child to obey all the time. My goal as a parent is to raise a competent adult who loves God. That's the best way to serve them. Now, sometimes putting my children first is going to mean doing things that they don't like. We'll come back to that next week. But you see in both of these sections, as we're looking at relationships, we're looking at relationships at work, the right thing to do is to honor Christ by putting the other person first in whatever way is appropriate for the situation. In the situation at work, we saw what it was. I'm going to obey my boss if I'm an employee, and I'm going to serve him like I would serve Christ. If I'm an employer, I'm not going to mistreat my employees. I'm not going to be too hard with them. If I'm a child, the right thing for the situation is to obey my parents, although I got to learn how to honor them as I grow. If I am a parent, I got to not exasperate my kids. Okay, now this is all very important as we get to the final section and the main section for today, which is on marriage. And we've done all that setup so that hopefully we can understand what's being said to husbands and wives. Now, just before we jump into marriage, if you are not married, you can still take everything from this and learn from it. It's very good that you're listening to this, whether you're married or not. If you're not married, it might be that someday you are. Even if you are not married and it's clear you're not going to get married, or marriage is in the past for you, this is still something you can actively learn from because it tells us how male and female relationships are supposed to work in general. It tells us specifically for marriage, but it can be expanded and understood a little bit more broadly as well. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of this, but I am going to speak to married couples as we go into this section. So if you're not married, don't think I'm not talking to you. You're just going to need to understand it a little bit more generally. Okay? So let's go into the section on marriage here. And what I'm going to ask is that as we go through it, you remember, hold on to that, the way to fight the invisible war is to honor Christ by putting each other first in whatever way is appropriate for the situation. And now we're going to see what way is appropriate in marriage. And Paul did this one first. I think he did it first because in his culture, it was the easiest one for him to relate. Everybody already agreed with what he was about to say, or in some ways, what he was saying was easier. It was actually liberating for women. But the problem in our culture, and why I've done it last, is that that's not how it's often taken today. Okay, so let's go into it. And first, just before we go in, one more illustration here. We're going to use this illustration as we go through the section on marriage and draw our final points for the morning. This is a Roman army. All right? A Roman army. And you can see that there are different roles within the Roman army. All right, so we're thinking about it, fighting the invisible war here and putting each other first in whatever way is appropriate for the situation. You can see in this image, hopefully you can see it online fairly well, you've got in the front, you've got a commander. Okay, this is the centurion who's commanding this entire section of troops. Then you've also got, in the front, you've got legionaries. So these are the sort of heavy infantry for the Roman army. This is what you think of when you think of a Roman soldier. It's the armor that we looked at last week. But behind the legionaries, you have a row of archers. And this is a kind of Roman soldier that's not often talked about. It's not the first soldier that we think of, but these soldiers are absolutely essential to the whole army winning the battle. Okay, so we're going to use these soldiers, and it's not a perfect analogy, so bear with me. We're going to use these two different types of soldiers to help us think about husbands and wives. All right, so the legionaries are going to represent the husbands for us, and the archers are going to represent the wives for us. And even as we read the text, we're going to think about these soldiers. So the legionaries, they are in the front. And they are the ones who are going head to head against the enemy. They've got their shields, they've got their swords. They are fighting on the front line. They're the heavy infantry. But they cannot win. They cannot hope to win this battle unless they've got support from the archers. Unless the archers are doing their job, which is a different job, shooting those arrows over the top into the enemy, these infantrymen cannot hope to win. But in the same way, the archers in the back, they cannot hope to win if these infantrymen are not there. If the legionaries in the front are not there, in fact, if they separate from each other and try to do their own thing, they're all going to die. That's what's going to happen. So, the legionaries might make it out in a little bit better shape, but they're going to lose the battle. The archers, if they don't stay right close to the legionary, they are not going to last very long in close combat. They're going to go down. And so these two roles have to be coordinated within the army in order to win the invisible battle. They must be. That's what the centurion is doing. But now imagine for a minute that they might have different ideas at different moments in the battle. The legionaries are seeing things in a little bit different way than the archers are. Because to the archer is looking for how they can hit something with an arrow. The legionary is looking for how they can strike something with a sword. They are standing in different positions in the fight. In fact, in many ancient battles, the archers weren't this close. They were used as scouts and lookouts. So the legionaries desperately need the information that the archers have. But they have to combine that. And the way to do it is by all of them not following each other necessarily, but following the command of the centurion, honoring him, and then putting each other first. Okay, let's read the text now, and we'll see what we can get out of this. Here's how Paul begins. A wife should put her husband first, as she does the Lord. A husband is the head of his wife, as Christ is the head and the Savior of the church, which is his own body. Wives should always put their husbands first, as the church puts Christ first. Of course, this is the section that has caused a lot of problems. A lot of people, even women in the church, hear this section, and it's very difficult to hear. But let's point out, let's look carefully at what Paul is actually saying here. I've used a translation, I've used the contemporary English version, because if you're looking at a different translation, what you're going to see is the word submit. And sometimes women react negatively to that word. Paul says that a wife should submit to her husband. It is a valid translation of the Greek text that's there, but it is a different word than is used in the work relationships, the master-slave relationships, and in the parent-children relationships. I want to point that out first of all. It is a different word. So when Paul says, children, you need to obey your parents, he uses a word that very clearly means obey. You need to hear what they're telling you to do and go do it. He is using a different word here when he talks about wives and husbands. And so the word here, I think the CEV has done a very good job. A wife should put her husband first. He is in some way the head. He is the one that she should be following and allowing him to lead in significant ways. But it does not mean that she has to always obey him. Notice also what the text does not say. It does not say that the husband is Jesus or that he is the Lord. It says that her attitude toward her husband needs to be similar to the church's attitude towards Jesus. Now that's nothing more than what we've been saying this whole time. The wife needs to honor Christ by putting her husband first in the way that's appropriate for that relationship. That's what's being said here. She needs to think about it not as if she's just honoring him or respecting him, but she's doing that in order to honor and respect Jesus. And this is the way that's appropriate for the relationship, the way that God has set it up. And if we'll do this, this is a huge secret to how we can win this invisible war, how we can come through the coronavirus lockdown with families not only intact, but stronger than they were before because we've spent time together. So, thinking about that image of the archer again. The wife, okay, so our point here, we'll bring this point out. The wife needs to honor Christ by honoring and respecting her husband. So wives, honor Christ by honoring and respecting your husband. This is the way that Paul says we can fight this invisible war. And let's go back again and think about just this for a second. So now imagine a husband and wife, imagine them for a moment as, just two who are fighting together. This is the basic unit of God's army for most of us, is this husband-wife relationship. So imagine that the husband is here, the analogy could be pushed too far, but go with me for a minute. Imagine that the husband is the legionary and the wife is the archer. Now, it's actually very similar in some ways. The wife often has information about the battle that the husband doesn't have. Just like the archers were scouts. She often can see things. She's on the lookout for things that the husband isn't on the lookout for because he's going off into his mission. He's focused on the mission that's right in front of him. She is looking out for him. She's shooting these arrows, doing her part of the job. but they need to stay together. So I don't know how it is in your marriage, for those of you who are husbands and wives, but for many of us, I know in my marriage, almost any time, Amber and I try to do something together, we have completely opposite ideas about how to do it. Is that right, Amber? Completely opposite ideas about how to, that could be anything. That could be about, what should we be doing as a church, sort of our large-scale strategy, what should that be? What should our schedule as a family be? How should we fold the laundry? It could be anything. We will come up with a totally different way to do it. That's because we're made differently. Now, for a Roman army, think about that legionary and the archer, don't you think they came up with different ideas about what to do? Just like a husband and wife have pressure on their marriage and our relationships all the time from the outside, they were in a battle, the legionary and the archer. They had to stay together. They had to move together. But no doubt there was a temptation many times for the archer to say, no, we've got to do this. We got to go this way. And for the legionary to say, no, we got to do this. We got to go the other way. But what they have to do, what's essential for their lives, what's essential for them to fight the battle and win, is that they have to stay together. If they go opposite ways, the legionary no longer has support from the archer, and the archer no longer has that shield and sword in front of them from the legionary. They're both going to die. They're going to die in the invisible war. So they've got to find a way to stay together. And the way to stay together is to honor the centurion. Now, mostly, this section that Paul has given to us in 5:22 to 24 is not about decision making. Mostly it's not. Mostly it's about attitude. But there are times when a husband and wife will disagree on things. And what Paul is asking is that in those moments, wives would let husbands lead. He is asking that. Just like the centurion in this battle is saying, there might be a moment in the battle where you legionaries disagree with the archers, and in those moments, most of the time you're going to listen to each other, incorporate all the information you have, but in those moments what you need to do is stick with the legionary, even if he turns out to be wrong. And by doing it, you're honoring the captain, the centurion. This is what Paul is suggesting. Now, husbands, do not take this and go try to tell your wives what to do. That would be completely the wrong thing to do. He is not telling us this. This part is to who? It's to the wives. Let's see what he says to the husbands. A husband should love his wife as much as Christ loved the church and gave his life for it. He made the church holy by the power of his word, and he made it pure by washing it with water. Christ did this so he would have a glorious and holy church, without faults or spots or wrinkles or any other flaws. In the same way, a husband should love his wife as much as he loves himself. Whoa. A husband who loves his wife shows that he loves himself. That's a powerful statement. Just a couple things we'll say about this. Men and women, husbands and wives, are made differently. Our culture right now is trying to say that that's not true, but it is very much true. It is actually obvious in life that men and women are different. We're made differently with different strengths. One way to see this is by simply asking the question, who dies? Imagine you're on a modern day Titanic. You're on a ship, and there's men and women and children on board the ship, and the ship is sinking, and there's no way to save it, and there's no life preservers, and there's no one coming for help. There's just a few lifeboats, and there's only enough for a certain portion of the people on the ship. So just like what happened with the Titanic. Let me ask you this. Who dies? The answer is the men. The men die. It's obvious. And it's not only what It's not only what the women would want or what the children would want. In fact, they don't want their husbands and their fathers to die. But if someone needs to die, it's clear that it needs to be the men. It's what the men would want as well in that situation. Do the men want to die? Well, no, they don't want to die. But they know that it's the right thing in a situation like that. And this is very much what Paul is getting at. The calling of the husbands is to lay down our lives for our wives. So again, this part is not for the wives. So wives, don't put this in your back pocket to use against your husband later. No, don't do that. But husbands, this is for you. Our calling is to lay down our lives for our wives. Our calling is to love them and give up our lives for them. In some situations, maybe for some of us sometimes that's going to mean physically giving up our lives to protect our families, protect our wives and our children. But most of the time, that's going to mean in the invisible war, in the battle that happens every single day, in daily life. You see, she's part of your mission. The other thing that I want to point out for the husbands, let's go back to this picture again, of the army, legionaries, husbands. You cannot just think, I have a mission in life, it's my work, it's whatever God's given me to do. You cannot just march off and do your mission without your archer behind you. You cannot. If you do, you're going to fail in your mission. In fact, what Paul is clearly saying here in this section, as we look at it, is that she, if you are married, if you're a husband and you are married, she is now part of your mission. Helping her become who she was made to be. Helping her use her gifts within your marriage and outside in the world. Helping her do what she was called to do is part of your mission. And you need to love her in order to do it. So here's the point for the husbands. The point for the husbands is this: honor Christ by laying down your life and loving your wife. Honor Christ by laying down your life and loving your wife. This is powerful stuff. So here are just a couple of questions to wrap up with, and we're thinking about how we can live this out in practical ways. We got to stop fighting for control. We got to recognize that we're different, and that is God-given. And we got to figure out how to lean on the strengths that each of us have and work together as a team. How can I love her? Husbands should be asking this question. How can I love her in this situation that I'm in right now? When I feel like things aren't going well, when I'm stuck at home, when we're fighting, when we're arguing, when we're just going different directions and don't feel like a team, how can I love her in this situation and lay down my life for her? Wives should be asking this question: how can I respect and honor him in this situation? No matter what he's doing, no matter whether he deserves it or not, how can I respect and honor him in this situation in order to honor Christ? And finally, this applies broadly. We'll talk about this more next week. In any relationship, how can I honor Christ in this situation? The battle is in relationships. It's in relationships. As we wrap up the message today, I just want to ask us a question. We've seen from the beginning the relationships that are our very best relationships, the ones that are meant to change the world, give meaning to our lives. Those are often the relationships that are the very hardest. The relationships between brothers growing up, the relationships between parents and children, husbands and wives. They're meant to bring life into the world as we work together, relying on each other's strengths. But they often spiral downwards and out of control. But what would it look like? What would happen if we all started putting into practice, even just during this lockdown time, if we all started putting into practice honoring Christ by putting each other first? What could happen in your family? What could happen with your kids 20 years from now if you live this out in your marriage today? What could happen in our church if all of a sudden we come out of this lockdown and our families have learned how to rely on each other's strengths and work as a team? What happened if we stop subtly putting each other down in our minds because we're different from each other, and we learned that we're different from each other for a reason? We're different for a reason, and we learned how to rely on the strength of the other person. I'll tell you what, a miracle could happen. Even just a little church like us, we could change this whole city by God's power. Honor Christ by putting each other first. Let's pray and we'll continue in worship.